So my name's Roy, for those of you that don't know me. And I have a connection with both the Buddhist Society and Jamyang Buddhist Centre. For those of you that do know Jamyang Buddhist Centre, there's some very good news, although slightly sad for Jamyang, but very good on the wider front, and that's Geshe Tashi, who's our resident teacher, has been appointed the abbot of Seramay Monastic University in South India. So congratulations to Geshe, and if any of you know Geshe, I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear that. It doesn't mean it's goodbye forever, as it were. Normally those posts are 5 to 7 years, but he'll have they have enough time for him to travel, return, teach, and so on. So, and Jamyang will no doubt over that period be looking to find another resident teacher, but that takes time. But anyway, congratulations to Geshe. And this really is the second of talks sort of exploring a bit more in a very simple and basic way the Kalachakra or Wheel of Time Tantra. And they're really talks that the Buddhist Society asked me to do after the visit of Khenpo Rinpoche here to speak about the Kalachakra Tantra and to try and amplify that and maybe open Tantra and the Kalachakra Tantra in particular up to people that may have an interest but not previously had a connection with it. And Francesca coming later to talk about what is Tantra in the round, as it were. I wouldn't miss that if I were you, and I'll probably be on a seat here myself. She really is an excellent speaker and an excellent teacher, and no better person to come and talk about Tantra and its nature. So, how many of you were here when Khenpo Rinpoche came? 1, 2, 3. And then how many were here for the first talk that I gave? Okay, so I apologise to you because there'll have to be a bit of overlap on the last talk for people who've come new. For those of you that weren't at either of those talks or Khenpo Rinpoche's visit, how many of you have had an encounter with, or maybe even have, a tantric practice? Okay, thank you. That kind of helps me in terms of where I'm going to pitch it. Also, for those of you that do either have or develop an interest in the Kalachakra Tantra, Khenpo Rinpoche is coming back to the UK in September. And from September the 26th to September the 30th, he'll actually be giving a Kalachakra initiation or empowerment. Yeah, for those of you that may have an interest in that. I don't know what his requirements will be for that, but Kalachakra initiation is often given where people can go and take the initiation as a blessing. But sometimes the master giving the initiation will say the initiation is being given for people who wish to take the initiation and become practitioners. So it may be worth keeping an eye on Khenpo Rinpoche's website and seeing what the circumstances are. But for anybody who's actually looking for an opportunity to take Kalachakra empowerment, there it is. He'll be doing that at the Study Society in Hammersmith, September 26th to 30th. And then I think in October he'll actually be doing a short retreat on the innate Kalachakra practice. And we'll get to that a little later in terms of the innate Kalachakra practice, because what I was going to try and do with this second talk was have a little bit of a look at Kalachakra practice. It's not an easy thing to do because, of course, Kalachakra practice is for people who've received the empowerment, and so there's a lot one can't discuss if people haven't had the relative empowerment in terms of permission to study and practice. So this will be, again, an overview in dealing with things that are commonly available and commonly known, to try and sort of deepen and assist our understanding of Kalachakra practice. But that short retreat will be following the, and no doubt people who go for the empowerment will want to go for the retreat if they can. It's in Tintern, which is in Wales. Yeah, it's kind of mid-Wales, from October the 4th to October the 7th. Do you know if Kent is he going to come and do a talk at the Society as well in that period? I don't know.
I'm not. I think he might be. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Definitely.
Could you tell us?
26th, is that Wednesday?
Was that the evening of the first day of the empowerment?
No, the empowerment. I think the empowerment's the weekend.
Okay, well that's the 26th to the 30th on his schedule that I'm looking at here.
Okay, well that includes a talk here.
Okay, that's very, very good. Anyway, keep an eye on the Society's website and his own for further information there. But it's a great opportunity. Very often people go to talks about the Tantra or about the Kalachakra, and then they say, well, I'm really, really interested. They do some more study, and then say, where can I get an empowerment? And they may have to wait a long time or travel to India or whatever. So here actually is an opportunity for those who are interested to consider taking that empowerment from a master of one of the traditions, the Jonangpa tradition, that have a very special relationship with the Kalachakra, and in particular with its what's known as its completion stage practices of the 6 yogas. So anyway, without any more ado, I think we just quickly have to go back and look at what the Buddha taught in the beginning, because the Tantra comes out of that, rests upon it and incorporates it. It's not something separate from it, not something that can be divorced or ripped away from it in that way in a Buddhist context. So again, it's going back to the first turning of the wheel, to the Four Noble Truths, and saying, why would we walk a Buddhist path at all? Well, we walk a Buddhist path because we accept the Four Noble Truths. And the first Noble Truth, the truth of dukkha, or suffering, is one that the Buddha said because in each of his declarations, if you like, of the Four Noble Truths, he also told us what it was that we should do with that truth. So in the case of dukkha, or suffering, what we should be doing with it is understanding it. Yeah. And the second Noble Truth was the truth of the origin of suffering. Yeah. And the truth of the origin of suffering is connected with the idea of ignorance in a very special sense. Ignorance not in terms of being ill-mannered or uneducated, but ignorance in the sense of kind of actively taking things to exist in the way they appear. And as a result of that, having an attachment, an aversion based upon an illusion of how we exist and how things exist, and suffering accordingly. So with the origin of suffering, you are looking to root out the cause of suffering, to eliminate the cause of suffering, to bring about the cessation of suffering. Called a true cessation when that occurs. And indeed, from one point of view, one could define enlightenment as the cessation of suffering. Yeah, it's the way to go, as it were. So the third and the fourth Noble Truths are talking about the reality of the cessation of suffering, the possibility of nirvana, and the Noble Eightfold Path to those cessations that would lead to enlightenment, nirvana, and so on and so forth. So when you look at how this is practiced in the sutra traditions, this is in the pre the rise of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist Tantra. The practice is one that is done in terms of trying to understand the nature of suffering, trying to understand and identify the origin of suffering, and then to root it out by following the Noble Eightfold Path to the cessation of suffering. And in the sutra traditions and teachings, although, of course, there is no hard and fast rule here, but if you look at all the accounts in the sutras and the shastras of how long it might take a person to become enlightened, then this could take a very long period of time indeed, because this is seen as going on beginninglessly and endlessly over a very long series of lives indeed. And with the second turning of the wheel, the emergence of the Mahayana, the Prajnaparamita literature, and the Bodhisattva path, there was the development of an idea which was already there, which is the universal scope of altruism, wisdom, and compassion, which is saying that if a person can understand suffering and identify its origin, then why would that person who is aware that they are a sentient being like all other sentient beings merely seek to follow the Noble Eightfold Path for themselves alone? And the Mahayana motivation with this universal scope of altruism is to yearn and to wish and to develop the awakening mind, or bodhicitta, to say, I wish to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. That's the universal scope of the altruism. And the Bodhisattva path and the perfection of the 6 perfections, in the case of the Mahayana, is aimed at achieving enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Indeed, there's something in the Bodhisattva path that's going one step further. It's not just saying, may all beings be enlightened, may all beings be well, may all beings be happy, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, may all beings gain liberation from samsara and full enlightenment. But he's going one step further and say, and may I take personal responsibility for that myself, to bring about the enlightenment of all sentient beings. Then with the emergence of Tantra came the idea that by using meditation and yogic techniques, it might be possible to accelerate the path to enlightenment. This being done again, not for oneself alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. So if you like, might be loose language, but it's the idea of saying, if we have the possibility of gaining liberation and full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, and there were a meditative, contemplative, or spiritual discipline and technology which could accelerate that for the benefit of all sentient beings, why would we not pursue it? And so that's really what's happening with Tantra. Tantra is saying the time from ignorance to enlightenment can be shortened, that there may even be the possibility of the realization of enlightenment in one lifetime, and these are the methods that one would use if one was practicing in that way. So that's the kind of spirit in which the Buddhist Tantra developed. So those practices were available in the tradition passed on from teacher to student, and the role in Tantra, the role of the teacher or the guru is paramount. Yeah? And an empowerment, in Tibetan called a wang, in Sanskrit an abhisheka, which is like an empowerment that gives you permission to study and practice, is offered through a ritual, very often based upon a sand mandala. In nearly every case in the empowerment of the Kalachakra Tantra, a sand mandala is required as the basis for the empowerment. There is one tradition of Abhayakaraguptas where it can be done with a painted cloth, like a tanka of the mandala properly prepared, but usually it's done with a sand mandala. And the Kalachakra initiation, going right back to Dolpopa, Sherab Gyaltsen, unlike the empowerments into other tantras, was very often done to very large groups of people publicly, and that tradition's carried on down to the present time by His Holiness Dalai Lama. If you go to, has anybody been to a Kalachakra initiation by His Holiness, then you'll find that, particularly if you go in India, then you may be looking at well in excess of 20,000 people coming to receive the blessings of the Kalachakra initiation. It's that empowerment, if it's taken seriously, that empowers practitioners to begin studying and practicing the Tantra. And you'll remember, those of you who were here before or have had some introduction to Tantra and its structure and so on already, will know that tantric practice has two parts. There's one part that's called a generation, or sometimes a creation stage, and another part which is called a completion or a perfection stage. And the generation stage involves meditative practice using deity yoga. Deity yoga, if anyone's sort of saying, well, are there a few things or some one thing that we could say really defines Buddhist Tantra? And I think it's fairly safe to say that at every level what defines it is deity yoga. In the lower tantras, up to Yoga Tantra, you remember there was Kriya, Karya and Yoga Tantra, and then highest Yoga Tantra, Maha Anutara Yoga Tantra, or in the Nyingma tradition it's often called Maha Yoga or Maha Anu, two parts, the same as highest Yoga Tantra. The deity is visualized either in front of the meditator or above the head of the meditator, or some combination of both. But in highest Yoga Tantra, the meditator dissolves themselves into emptiness and then generates themselves as a deity. Yeah? And it's the empowerment that makes that possible. For example, very common in all of the traditions, if you are looking at the lower tantric meditations, maybe green Tara, white Tara, Vajrasattva, any of these meditative deities, you can go to a Buddhist center that has a tantric lineage or practice and begin by visualizing Vajrasattva on the top of your head, or praises to Tara with Tara in front. And to do this, no empowerment is required. And very often the teacher will say, we're going to do this. If you haven't received the empowerment, please don't generate yourself as the deity, but visualize the deity in front of you or on the top of your head. Yeah? So it's the empowerment in highest Yoga Tantra which gives you the permission, plants the seed for the possibility of generating yourself as the deity after having dissolved yourself into emptiness. Yeah? And that may be done gradually or instantaneously. And the generation stage practices are about practicing how to do that. Yeah? How to dissolve yourself into emptiness in meditation and then generate yourself as the deity. And that generation or creation stage is using creative imagination and visualization to imagine yourself dissolving into emptiness and then arising as the deity. And then by using the iconography of the tradition of the deity that you have been initiated into the practice of, in Tibetan known as the Yidam, and essential to Tantra also, as some of you may remember from last time, I was saying that there's something right at the core of Tantra which also relates to the special status of the Guru and your own Buddha nature. The Guru is holding up a mirror to your own Buddha nature to have you recognize the nature of your own mind. Yes? And when an empowerment from a Guru followed by the permission to practice a particular Yidam deity, to generate yourself as that deity, it's really, really important to understand that the Guru's mind and the Yidam's mind, the mind of the imagined deity, and your own mind are one and the same, are in union there. So initially, this practice of the generation or creation stage is undertaken using creative imagination and visualization, so that it is as if you were generating yourself as the deity. Yeah? You're using your imagination. You're imagining yourself to be empty, of course, from a philosophical point of view, from the point of view of the view, if you like. We are all empty. You know, we are all of one nature. Yeah? Shunyata, or our empty nature, is our Buddha nature. It's the possibility of infinite potential which makes the realization of enlightenment possible. It also makes possible the dissolution of the ordinary sense of self and the arising with divine pride in the form of a deity. Yeah? So in the completion stage practice, you are then moving to developing in highest yoga tantra the subtle physiology of the deity, which are where you see the yogic techniques of the channels, the right channel, the left channel, the central channel, and the bringing of the winds from the right and left channel into the central channel for the realization of full enlightenment. This is a very simplistic kind of explanation, but it's giving you an idea that what's being focused on here is what are known as winds, channels, and drops. Drops, bindu, yeah? The winds are the winds which are the supports for consciousness, and the channels, the Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna in the Sanskrit, the channels of the subtle body. And this is the, if you like, the meditative yogic techniques which are being used to realize enlightenment via highest yoga tantra. Yeah? And there is also underlying here the idea of the purification of the physical body, and in those terms, the purification here again goes right back to the first turning of the wheel. That purification is the cessation of the suffering of, yes, And in the purification, in that sense, there is the possibility of realizing the three bodies of a Buddha: the Dharmakaya, kaya being body, the empty nature, yeah? The Sambhogakaya, the clarity, the lucid manifestation, and the Nirmanakaya, which is the physical body of a Buddha, which is untrammeled, compassionate energy working for the benefit of all sentient beings. So the purpose of the deity yoga and the yogic practices, realization of full enlightenment, liberation from samsara, but also the generation of the bodies of a Buddha. Yeah. And there are slightly differing methods amongst the tantras of how this is brought about and just what the result will look like. And with many of the highest yoga tantras, the translation term is that the body of the deity that's being generated is the illusory body. In the Kalachakra Tantra, slightly different, it is looking to generate the body of empty form. Yeah? So these are technical differences in the way the deity is generated and realized. Yeah? And it's the idea of empty form which really marks out the Kalachakra as unique and distinct from the other highest yoga tantras in this area. It's also marked out in the sense that the highest yoga tantra traditions are sort of marked into father, mother and non-dual. So the father tantras are primarily concerned with realizing through method or compassion. The mother tantras are focusing on the wisdom aspect. And then there is another category which are non-dual, which are working on both. But I think singularly the only tantra that's sitting there as genuinely non-dual is the Kalachakra Tantra. It's kind of, that's another part of its uniqueness. So when someone's taken the initiation and looks to begin practicing deity yoga, there are differences among the traditions where some people would start to do generation or creation state practice, and when that was perfected to a certain level, then they would be introduced to completion state practices. In some traditions, the two might run together. So generation stage and completion stage would be taught and practiced alongside one another. And within each of the traditions, how this goes may very much depend upon the teacher. i.e., what does the teacher want to do? What does he prescribe or recommend for the student in that case? So if you read or hear of someone, oh yes, but they do this together, they don't do that separately, it's really, really important to think that, again, going back to the primacy and significance of the guru or the teacher in Tantra, it's a matter of what the teacher has asked the disciple to do. Yeah? So very often, I am not a tantric teacher. I'm not qualified to teach Tantra as a guru would teach Tantra. Yeah. So very often people might come to me as a fellow practitioner and say, oh, but what do you do when you're doing this? And I might say, if they have the empowerment and I'm able to speak to them in that way, or I do the following. oh well, my teacher never said to do that, then my answer is follow what your teacher told you to do, because the teacher, out of their tradition, will have made an assessment of the disciple in that situation and said, practice this way. And so it's kind of imperative that you, if you take an empowerment and make a commitment to a teacher, that you follow what the teacher says and don't run around comparing it with what other people with other teachers might be doing, or indeed with what other students with the same teacher might be doing. But to rest content in your relationship with your own teacher and to faithfully follow the practice as he or she is laying it out for you. Yes, it's really quite important in the guru-chela relationship that that's how it works. Now, once you've taken the initiation, and regarding the person who gave you the initiation as your teacher, as your Vajra master, as would be said in the Buddhist tantric traditions, you would usually then undertake to do some preliminary practices, in Tibetan known as nondro. Yeah? Nondro. And these preliminary practices would be usually, again, determined by the teacher, although we can talk about what sort of a range of practices that package may be made up from. And these practices would also involve quite a lot of repetitions or numbers of repetitions. And sometimes very, very high numbers are asked. But again, it's not as if, oh, well, there's some one number. For example, a teacher may ask a disciple to do 5 or 6 preparatory practices, preliminary practices, for 10,000 repetitions. Another may ask for 1,000,000, or anything in between. Again, it very much depends on the teacher, the tradition, the student, and so on. So, having a look at those practices, and they're very much common across all of the Tibetan traditions. I think rather interestingly, someone some time ago asked His Holiness if he'd put together a kind of non-sectarian nondro or set of practices that could be used by someone no matter which tradition they were coming from, or maybe all traditions and none, or whatever. And he smiled and said, there's plenty of nondro texts out there, but unfortunately there's a shortage of people prepared to do them. If you look, I'll try and identify some of the things that you'd find in any traditions, preparatory practices or nondro. There's often a set of 4 meditations that are sometimes called the ordinary preliminaries, or the 4 meditations to change attitudes, or sometimes more poetically, the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. Yeah? And those are the contemplation of these are meditations, yeah, of the difficulty of obtaining the freedom and conditions, i.e. precious human existence, from which it might be possible to have the opportunity to gain liberation from samsara and full enlightenment. And if you go back to the Wheel of Life, you'll know in the 6 realms of Buddhist cosmological theory, there is only one place out of the 6 realms from which you can indeed, as a sentient being, achieve liberation from samsara and full enlightenment, and that is as a human being. So this first meditation or contemplation is on the preciousness of human life, because of the opportunity offered, which you won't even find in the God realm or the realm of the Titans or anywhere else. Yes, it's the only place from which it's possible. So reflection on that is often in the Lam Rim or graduated path text will have quite a lot to say about the preciousness of human life and also its rarity. In fact, I think the metaphor most often used in all the traditions is the one of a turtle coming from immense depths in a vast ocean to the surface and finding a ring floating on the surface that it can stick its neck through. They say there's more chance of the turtle finding the ring and getting its head through the neck than there is of us being born human. So that preciousness of human life is the first of the four thoughts that turn the mind. And then the second one is really the recollection of death and impermanence. Again, going back to the first turning of the wheel, and indeed the four thoughts that the Buddha encountered that led him to set out on a path to seek a profound understanding of the nature of reality, were about sickness, death, impermanence. Yes, it's reflecting on that, and many of the practice tests again are saying you've got a precious human life. The time between birth and death is brief. You look at it from a cosmological perspective, it's less than a spark. So don't lose any opportunity. It becomes a kind of an impetus, a spur to deepen the commitment and really get into the practice and not to waste time, which all the time is running out. Yes. So that's the impermanent death and impermanence are really the second of the four thoughts that turn the mind. And then you've got looking at ways in which actions mature into results. That goes under the rubric of karma. Really sort of looking into, if this happens, if this action occurs, then what's the result? And very much looking at that in terms of one's own life. i.e. really getting to know the nature of cyclic existence and the power of how things arise based upon causes and conditions, abide for a while and then disappear when those causes and conditions themselves no longer support the ripening of the action, and also really understanding the inevitability of it. The fact that actions have consequences, and it might be quite difficult, in some cases ineluctable, to avoid the consequences of the action. In other cases it might be. It depends upon the nature of the action. But just reflecting on karma in the sense of causes, conditions and their results or consequences is the third of the four thoughts. And then the fourth one is really kind of reflecting on the viciousness of cyclic existence. The suffering that's experienced by sentient beings who are not on the path to enlightenment or are not seeking to realize enlightenment. There's a sense there also of there being two arrows. Yes, there's the one that's fired that may actually cause me physical suffering, but then my mental reaction to it is almost very often like firing another arrow in and over the top of that. But the meditation, although it would include that, is somewhat wider in the sense that it's really looking at the vicious nature of cyclic existence to generate the wish to emerge from it, to seek liberation from samsara, cyclic existence, habitual conditioning, and to seek to realize full enlightenment. So those are the four thoughts that turn the mind. And they kind of come before any of the non-dro practices are engaged in. Yeah? The non-dro sort of comes after this. And there's also something in terms of tantric practice that said the aspirant to tantra, if you like, should have some kind of feel for or development of bodhicitta, the awakening mind, this rather special mind that is looking to generate and cultivate and ultimately have become spontaneous the deep wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, but is also actually going to go and do something about it. So it goes beyond aspirational bodhicitta into what's called engaged bodhicitta here. So a little of that's required, and a little shamatha and vipassana also required, i.e. some ability, some taste, some feeling that it is possible to calm the mind and to develop one's attention, to deepen one's concentration, and to then use that as a basis for insight into the nature of oneself and all phenomena in the universe. That's the insight or vipassana side. And the kind of propelling oneself along the path, if you like, the wisdom that comes from insight is required, but also you need to be able to generate energy for the development of positive potentials. Very often it's called merit, or translated as merit. But this is the kind of power that makes it possible to move from aspiring to engage bodhicitta to really start walking the path as opposed to reading about it or thinking about it. It's a powerful motivation. And very often if you look into the texts, Indian and Tibetan, they will talk about the two accumulations of merit and wisdom, and saying how difficult it might be to practice if you don't have enough positive potential and energy. So it is the preparatory practices, these preparatory practices for large numbers are entered into to generate this positive potential and energy, to generate this merit, so that there is sufficient to move into the path and make it a reality. Yeah? So to have looked at the four thoughts that turn the mind, in the lots of other descriptions of them, but I kind of like that one. It's a nice poetic one. And then to have some feel for, to have a little bit of bodhicitta, a little bit of shamatha, a little bit of vipassana. Then you enter into the non-dro or preparatory practices for tantric practice. And those, as I say, they may vary, but I'll try and give you an idea of what they would look like right across the spectrum of tantric traditions. And the first one would be meditation upon and practice of what's common across all Buddhist traditions and cultures. That's the taking of refuge. Rather beautifully described by Dr. Alex Berzin for me as taking safe direction. The refuge has some meaning, but it may be a little bit too other-powered. I don't know. It's the word refuge and its source in translation going back into the 19th century may borrow a little too much from theology and so on, whereas I think Alex Berzin's notion of safe direction, taking safe direction for our lives and practice from the founder of the teaching, the Dharma, or the teaching itself, which is the most important source of safe direction, and then the Sangha, those who would be our spiritual friends and guide us and help us rather than hinder us on the path, very often called the three jewels of Buddhism. So that is a formal practice in itself, where a merit field is visualized. The merit field can be extremely elaborate, where you might have your guru as the Buddha, and then you will have all the bodhisattvas, all the tantric deities, all the yogis and yoginis, all the lineage masters, very often done in what in the Indo-Tibetan tradition is called a refuge tree, is visualized. And then you do your refuge lines. I go to the Buddha, the founder, the Dharma, and the Sangha, in order to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. May it be so in that way. Or you can simplify by imagining all of those qualities, all of those figures in one image, an image of the Buddha, or an image of your guru as the Buddha, or whatever. It's a very simple way of doing it. There's a kind of an elaborate way of doing it, and a very simple way of doing it. Depends on your disposition, and may depend on, you might want to use both depending on how much time you have to practice, and so on and so forth. So that usually is the first common preliminary practice or nondro. And what we said is, the teacher may say, I want you to do 100,000 sets of refuge practices in that way on the cushion as a meditation, in order to qualify in having done that preparatory practice. So, and I think there's no variations on refuge or safe direction across the traditions, and understandably, because it's it's the very basis of the Buddhist path, and probably that and the acceptance of the Four Seals is what defines us as Buddhists, if we choose to self-identify as Buddhists, no matter which tradition or culture expression we're kind of associated with. So then the next one we've already spoken about is the cultivation of bodhicitta. The development, first of all, of aspiring or aspirational bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings, and then the cultivation of engaged bodhicitta. And very often in the nondro, the refuge and bodhicitta are put together as one practice. Because if you go back to the very fundamental lines, I go to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha with the wish that I might be enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. There you are, there's the refuge formula and the bodhicitta lines in one, coupled with the appropriate feeling, with the appropriate thoughts, with the appropriate concentration, the appropriate visualization and concentration. There you have the nondro practice of refuge and bodhicitta brought together in one. And then another practice common in the nondro would be guru yoga, or guru yoga, again back to the significance of the guru here. And a guru yoga would be done in which your guru would be visualized, and you would be receiving from his or her crown, throat and heart blessings. Yes, very often white from the head, red from the throat, and blue from the heart, and associated with the Sanskrit syllables Om, Ah, Hum. And the visualization of the guru, first the white, head to head, then the red, throat to throat, then the blue, heart to heart, one by one, and then all together, imagining that the blessings of the Guru are coming to you to bless you and enable the practice. The Guru may also be seen as embodying all the lineage masters right back to the Buddha and maybe beyond, to Vajradhara or Samantabhadra. And then when you've finished doing that, you imagine the Guru coming to the crown of your head, becoming very small, going down through the central channel, residing in your heart and then becoming one with you. Again, an echo of this idea of your mind, the Guru's mind, and the Yidam's mind, being one, yes? So there's a Guru Yoga there. There is, within the Gelugpa tradition, a 6-session Guru Yoga. It's a way of doing Guru Yoga that's particular to them, that's really quite interesting. And there's one there that is very interesting because embedded in it is the 24-armed Kalachakra deity is visualized as a part of that practice. Or if you were empowered, you would visualize it in front and then also generate yourself as the Kalachakra, and that will be embedded as a part of the Guru Yoga. It's something special to the Gelugpa tradition of practice, but a very interesting way of doing it. The other practice which is common is a Vajrasattva practice. Vajrasattva is a white meditational deity, and he's seen as being the personification or embodiment of all the Buddha's purifications. So it's a purification practice. So Vajrasattva would be visualized above the head. There would be 4 powers really. One is a power of remorse or regret. Wouldn't be, if it's seen as guilt, it would be going wrong. But it's calling to mind things that you may feel, I really want to desist from doing that. I really regret doing that. Yes, and they could be very personal, microcosmic things, or it could be something that's to do with, I really do want to purify all this ignorance, obscurations, habitual behavior that over time after time after time after time prevents me from realizing enlightenment, prevents me from gaining liberation from samsara. So it's saying that's what I'm looking to purify. Yeah? So there are many levels of purification done with this particular practice, the Vajrasattva practice. And then you would kind of rely upon Vajrasattva, or the power of Vajrasattva, to effect the purification. Yeah? So it would be saying, I'm going to rely on the visualization of Vajrasattva to effect the purification. The mantra would be recited, and as the mantra was being recited, the practitioner visualizes white, purifying energy. Usually it's a combination of light and nectar. Because again, the meditational deities, if you remember, are visualized as made of light. You don't visualize a tanka or a statue above your head. You're visualizing a meditational deity as actually made of light. And from them, this light would come, filling your body totally. Often seen as rays of light with spirals of nectar coming down the rays of light, filling your body, completely purifying whatever it is you have put as the object of purification. Yeah? And sometimes these would be in three again too, i.e. body, speech and mind. And so as far as the body is concerned, you may be visualizing everything that's being purified being forced out of all the lower orifices of the body. There's black tar, sometimes scorpions, spiders, all sorts of, however you want to visualize and personify that which is being purified. Then there's a filling up with the white light, and that will pour from all the upper orifices out. And then finally, white light will come down to the dark kernel of ignorance, avidya, at the heart, and either gradually dissolve it or in an explosion dissolve it. When those three are done, then there's a kind of a making a wish that you feel completely purified, and making a very strong wish that you will not again do the things that led to that for which you needed purification again. And visualizing that Vajrasattva is very happy with that, very pleased with that, becoming small, going down into the central channel, into the heart, and dissolving into you, and your body, speech and mind become one with Vajrasattva's body, speech and mind. Yeah? So that's another of the non-dro practices, meditations, and again you may be asked for 10,000, 100,000 or 1,000,000. Yeah? And it would be there is a long and a short Vajrasattva mantra. The long one's 100 syllables, and you would also be reciting that number of those mantras. Yeah, done. Sometimes these practices are done by going away on retreat and doing them continually in some traditions, and in other traditions it's just doing them daily until they're done. But in all the traditions there's no sense of, oh well, that's it, then there's no more to do. It's like for all the traditions, all of these practices, all these non-dro practices are a part of daily practice. So although you're going to say, I'm going to do a non-dro for my teacher before receiving more teachings on the more advanced stages of practice, so you would then count from there to your 10,000, 100,000 or million or whatever it was until you finished. That doesn't mean when you finish you'd stop doing them. You'd continue to do them, but you would offer that number over that time to the teacher. And I think all the traditions are quite strong on that, quite rightly, in terms of saying, no, it's non-dro, the preparatory practices are not just something to be done and got out of the way. They're something to be done continuously. It's the conscious marking of, I've done this particular number of these sets as required by my teacher or as an offering to my teacher before receiving further teaching. It's in that spirit that they're done. But there's a number of different ways of doing it. And different traditions may also have other non-dro practices, and one might very often be to meditate, to begin to meditate on the simplest form of the deity. So in the Kalachakra Tantra, it would be the Sahaja Kalachakra. That's not the 24-armed Kalachakra, but a solitary Kalachakra, or a Kalachakra with Vishvamata, but with one face, two arms, two legs. So it's a much simpler form, often called the Sahaja Kalachakra. And then once those preliminaries are done, then you may be introduced to, first of all, the generation stage practices. So for daily practice, you may continue to use the two-arm Sahaja Kalachakra practice, or there's a 9-deity practice, yes, using the full 24-armed form, but surrounded by 8 Shaktis in the cardinal and intermediate directions, and those Shaktis have emblems, 4 emblems, which you can see in some of the Kalachakra images. There aren't the Shaktis in that one. You know, they would be in front of the lotus, either side of the lotus, and iconographically depicted behind in the cardinal and intermediate directions. Or you, the next kind of most extensive form of the practice is the mind mandala practice. If you look at the Kalachakra mandala, there's the wisdom bliss palace at the top, then mind, speech and body, and they make up the Kalachakra mandala. So the mind mandala is really looking at the central lotus with Kalachakra and Vishvamata, surrounded by 4 Buddhas and their consorts, 6 Bodhisattvas and their consorts, and some wrathful deities and offering goddesses. It's a slightly more elaborate practice. I mean, this one can still be used as a daily practice, but it's more often mainly used as a retreat practice. And then finally, there's the full triple body, speech and mind mandala practice of Kalachakra, but that entails the full mandala of either 636 or 722 deities, depending on the tradition you're following. Yeah? And that one is really only used for major rituals or initiations. Yes, big Kalachakra initiations would involve that one. And there are some other rituals for which that would be done. I can remember doing one in Siliguri with Bokar Rinpoche and some of his monks and nuns on a Christmas day, and it took 9.5 hours to do, but that was done with full offerings, ritual implements and instruments and so on and so forth. And those sorts of practices are often associated with offering rituals, or what are called sog rituals. Sog rituals are 2 times in each month. People who take highest yoga tantra commitments also commit to doing a practice which is really a Eucharistic practice on 2 particular days in the Tibetan calendar. It's twice a month, as it were, and offerings would be made, and a Eucharist would be consumed. Very often a tiny amount of alcohol and a tiny amount of meat, and these would be purified and offered as sog, and they will be symbolic of the purification of your own, if you like, gross manifestation and body, with a view to its transformation into the 3 bodies of a Buddha. And then you'll see some of the more elaborate sadhanas can be used in those sog offerings, or some of those sog offerings could be quite simple with more simple practices. Again, it depends on context, time, place, significance, teacher, tradition, and so on. We're 1942 now. That's already a lot of information in getting into what Kalachakra practice looks like once we've taken the initiation, what kind of preparation we might need, what the preparatory practices might look like, then the beginning of the generation stage practice, and either subsequently or together the completion stage practices, which is the yogas of the subtle drops, winds and channels in the techniques of the subtle physiology. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Those of you who need to go, please go. Please stay for those of you who want to ask questions.
sorry, I wasn't there the last time. So what is the Kalachakra? What is it symbolizing? Why are we doing this particular practice?
Kalachakra literally in the Sanskrit means
Wheel
wheel of time.
Mm.
Yeah, wheel of time. So Kalachakra and Vishvamata, Yabyum in the Tibetan terms, locked in union, are representing aspects of wisdom and compassion, and also really in the Kalachakra tradition, I think the right way to highlight that aspect would be to talk about unchanging bliss in meditative equipoise upon emptiness. Yeah. So there's a whole, if you start to look at why Kalachakra rather than Chakra Samvara, Evajra, Yamantaka, or wherever you want to go, then you need to look into the history, chronology, development, aims, objectives of each of those tantric systems, and then think, either you may feel a connection with one, or you may meet a teacher who says, I think this is the practice for you. You know, it could go either way. So then why would you practice Kalachakra beyond coming back to the really fundamental one? Why would you do Tantra at all? You do Tantra because if you have a deep wish to realise the universal altruism of bringing about your own enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings as quickly as possible, that's why you would do it. Why you would do one Tantra rather than another may be affected by a whole raft of other considerations, yeah, which would come out of your connection with the Tantra or your teacher's connection with the Tantra. Yeah.
What is the history of the Kalachakra?
Huh?
Sorry. What's the history of Kalachakra?
Where
Where does it come from?
It came. It emerged in India, somewhere around the 10th century. Yeah. It's the last, historically, and most complex and comprehensive of all the Buddhist tantras. It began with the Gya Samaja Tantra, something like 1st to 2nd century. In the 10th century, the Kalachakra emerged, and it was emerging at a time where Buddhism faced destruction in northern India. Not just Buddhism, it was a time of incredible foment and destruction. And I think there was an idea there of bringing as inclusive a body of teachings together as possible, even including some teachings that would be regarded as non-Buddhist. Yeah? At a time of great foment and fear, thinking, might this be a seed bearer through time of the deepest and most profound understanding of reality as offered by the Buddha. Yeah, does that make sense?
I was thinking about the preliminary practices.
Yes.
Why are there so many repetitions? And is it just meditation practices, or are there physical ones like doing thousands of prostrations as well?
Prostrations.
Secondly,
Prostrations is a common one.
how do you keep count?
How do you?
Keep count.
With the mala around your neck. And
Right.
if you look at the thing coming off the bottom of your mala, yeah, there's like a smaller mala, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the mala's got 108 beads on it. So
Right.
let's say,
I'm just thinking if you've got.
let's say you allowed 100 on your mala. When you get to 1,000, you could put one of those little ones on. And so then you turn the mala into a kind of a bead
Right,
calculator
okay.
that can go up to hundreds of thousands.
But anyway, but why so many?
Huh?
Why so many?
It's to generate the positive potential required for the movement into Tantra. And if you focus in that way, doing those preparatory practices, you build up an awful lot of positive potential. And a lot of what will come up in you that may have been obstacles to your practice will have been purified. Because what will come up, why the hell am I doing this? I'm really bored. I can't do this anymore. This is terrible. Well, how much do you really want to? Yeah? And also, there are positive aspects to the practices, especially the purification practices and so on, that as you really get into them and really do a lot of them and really become... The Tibetan word for meditation is gom. Gom, literally translated, means familiarization. Well, if you're not familiar after 100,000, I don't know what, but there we are. Yeah, there's lots of reasons for those repetitions. There's also another way of thinking about it. I mean, Alex Berzin was saying, in a modern Western life, of course, he served Serkong Rinpoche for 20 years. He said he must have taken 100,000 phone calls and written 100,000 letters to serve his teacher. A mother could change 100,000 nappies. So on and so on and so on. It's an act of devotion, it's an act of love, it's something that is done to really deepen one's commitment and understanding and build up these positive potentials. Yeah?
You've got time for one more question.
Right, so where does this Kashmir Shivism, because Mahakaleshwar was Mahakalesh, so how does that link together?
Because there is... Hindu Tantra evolved at the similar time to Buddhist Tantra. They informed one another, there was exchange between them. And there is actually, as well as a Buddhist Kalachakra, there's a Hindu tradition of Kalachakra. Yeah? It's a distinctively Hindu form in which the Kalachakra would be a form or a manifestation of Shiva. Yeah. If you're looking at it from the point of view of the encoded symbology, it's the blue one, the all-pervader. Vajrasattva is blue, Kalachakra blue, or black actually. Just that the Tibetans don't have black pigment, so it's dark blue. Yeah. But there it is. There's a lot of commonality, but there is a distinctive Hindu Kalachakra Tantra as well. And indeed, Tantra itself probably born out of the cradle of Kashmiri tribes.
Can I thank you?
Thank you
very much. Thank you all.